there we are.
We're live from various parts of New York.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. We'll let everyone file in. My name is Chris, and I am the events manager at Powerhouse, and I am very happy to be hosting the launch for This Is What Democracy Looked Like by Alicia Chang. You can see it there.
I have one too. I know not everyone has one, but this is like it actually exists as a real.
It's what it will look like when it comes to your apartment or house. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen, which you can see at the bottom there. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and it's also been reposted in the chat.
I will just say, unsolicited, please support independent bookstores. Basically, you can, and if they don't carry it, that's a good reason to ask them to carry it. The idea is sort of anything but Amazon would be a nice way to get this book in your hands.
Right, so Alicia will be in conversation with Victoria Bassetti. Is that how you say it?
You got it.
I'll introduce them now. Alicia Chang is a graphic designer and founding partner of Management Design, based not far from Powerhouse in Dumbo. She has taught at Yale University, Princeton University, the Maryland Institute College of Art, Cooper Union, and currently serves as an external critic at the Rhode Island School of Design. While not a historian by training, she has always enjoyed geeking out on history. This Is What Democracy Looked Like is her first book. Victoria Bassetti is a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, a Law and Public Policy Institute, and is the author of Electoral Dysfunction, the companion book to the PBS series. She's been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Financial Times, and Harper's, and worked on Capitol Hill for almost a decade, among other posts, as chief counsel to Senator Dick Durbin and Herb Kohl. Vic served on the team that drafted the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, the Patriot Act, the Economic Espionage Act, and the Homeland Security Act. She was also a member of the select team of lawyers that oversaw the Senate impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton.
Impeachment.
Deal.
Yeah.
Right, let's go.
All right, it's this up to us now, Alicia.
Oh, okay, we have the mic, so to speak.
Over to you, yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. This is a new kind of experience of just watching participant number go up. So 73 people who apparently are tuning in. We can't hear you breathing, but we know you're out there. So welcome to the launch of this book. It has been in the works for on and off for maybe 3 years total. Certainly the end part got highly accelerated by my awesome publishers, Princeton Architecture Press. I'll just start by thanking everyone who was involved. Abby Bussel, Sarah Stemmen, Paul Wagner, and Valerie all helped really pull this book forward into the world when I was a little bit like, oh, we're never gonna make 2020. But they were like, no, we're gonna do it. So thank you for lighting the fire. And yeah, we got it done and in the world. So even though the launch was a bit delayed from a month, I think we're really just happy to be here, and we're happy that everybody was able to join for many, many reasons. So this launch, we called it a conversation. We'll be conversating in and out of ballot talk, but usually you have people reading from their books. And even though I have text to read, it seems like since this book is so visually oriented, I would read by showing. So it is sort of more one way, in which case I will have slideshows that sort of talk about the beginning of it and some samples of ballots, because I know some of you many of you probably haven't gotten your books. So this will be like a sampler. And then, Vic will, comment as she will with a few of them. And then we're going to end up and sort of talk about the current condition that we are living under. So barring any issues, bear with me while I share screen. And Okay, hopefully you all see that. The making of, this is what democracy looks like. Only because out of every presentation that I may or may not have for this book, this is kind of the only moment where I'm really going to talk about like how it really started. Not to get too boring, but just to say, it started in 2008 with this article in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore, who wrote about sort of early voting practices and how like violent and public they were, and it was really an eye-opener. But one phrase that she had just sort of put in there were that ballots were colorful, and I was like, what? Because that's not the ballot that I knew as a sort of, you know, citizen who did vote, but beyond that, didn't really explore that further. So that's how it began. And I just sort of, the internet was a little bit early in terms of keeping up with online archives. So I did some research. I talked to a few people. She actually met with me and really encouraged the research, which was really exciting. But then I just really doubled down and started seeing more collections that were online, not exclusively, but or heard about different collections. So ended up going to different libraries, whatever was like convenient for my travel schedule. And that's how I sort of started seeing and handling the actual ballots themselves. So along the way, I was able to do more research, obviously, at the New York Public Library, which is just an amazing institution. Clearly, it's an amazing institution because it's one of the largest libraries and one of the most historic. But also, they have this fellowship kind of application process where if you're doing research with materials that they hold, you can just apply for room in these study rooms and you get your own shelf. And, you know, like back in undergrad days when you can have stuff that's currently there, it was such a gift to be able to come in and just have the books that you were checking out just there for you. So I don't know if you can tell the delight in my pose. It was really a thrill to have my own shelf. I know my partner Sarah and my husband are like bored to tears about how awesome my shelf was, but it was also kind of fun looking at other people's shelves to sort of figure out what kind of projects they were working on. But this is the kind of stuff that was happening when I was there. I would put in, you know, call numbers of descriptions of things and not really know what I was going to get. But then it would come to me like a gift on Christmas or on my birthday and suddenly be these like amazing timelines of political parties or something that was just sort of, no one was watching me read it. I didn't have to wear white gloves. It was just sort of available. So that was like a constant fuel for just being so enthusiastic about continuing the research about what else I could find. So these are also process pictures. I hope Meredith and Kyle may be out there in the Ethernet watching. But this was a ballot that was 14 feet long that was in the New York Public Library's collection. And it was pretty awesome. And when we unfurled the whole thing, we were all like, oh my God. So that was an exciting moment at the New York Public Library. This is Vic. And I in the rare books room again, just sort of looking at this ginormous blanket ballot, which, you know, speculatively was used sort of as a sample, so everyone could see it, but just sort of the sheer volume of it was pretty awesome. I kind of like how everyone in these pictures are like mouth open, because that was a lot of what the experience sometimes was. Another kind of notable find was, and I hope Francis is out there, San Francisco, California Historic Society. I got this scrapbook that was just like this big crusty thing that was just like jam packed with ballots that were just all pasted on top of each other. And I was sort of like pouring through it. It was just, I felt so like overwhelmed afterwards. Like I had this huge Thanksgiving dinner for my eyeballs, but those kind of moments were just spectacular finds. Okay, so now let's talk about ballots. And I won't bore you, and neither will I go page by page through the book, but I think it's worth describing the arc of all of these through the artifact. And then we can sort of talk about the themes that carry through the overall democracy thing that we're all living through right now. So, you know, ballots today, this is what it is. I'm sure you have seen it recently if you were in the primary voting in New York. You know, boring and bureaucratic, but, you know, these are our direct tools of democracy, the way we express ourselves as citizens. But it's also how parties use it as a tool for power and control, and also how to express themselves. But, you know, it's a direct reflection of this path of our democracy, which obviously these past months have shown is not an easy path. It's not a straight path. It's not sort of a heroic one. One historian phrased it as a checkered tale of motion forward, backward, and sideways, which I think is very appropriate. But, you know, my discovery before times was seeing like, this is what I knew, that this was a ballot, but also this was a ballot from 1864, or this was a ballot from 1878, or even this as a ballot from 1865, and this one from 1870, which is one of my favorite crazy letterpress bonkers ones. So, you know, we again, just sort of, it helps to show this very boring photo as a context for where we live, to how the condition we are today. You know, poll worker, ballot, everyone's wearing a mask, rickety tables, no one can see you, but you're just sort of waiting in line. It's usually really dull. You get a sticker, you know, that's how we vote. We used to vote. But, you know, back then, say in the 18th century, elections were just hugely social. You know, they had accounts of huge parades, bonfires, bands of citizens trying to convince other voters to celebrate their party. It was like a super public event where everyone was engaged. You know, there wasn't a lot going on. So, you know, there wasn't amusement parks yet. So this was the way that communities would, you know, express themselves, get everyone together and sort of display their allegiances really publicly. Plus, there were a lot more elections then. You know, there used to be, people used to be appointed, but then suddenly suffrage got sort of opened up with universal male suffrage. And then more offices, more candidates, more voters, everyone was engaged. It's kind, I mean, it's ironic to having this talk right at this moment versus when I first did some version of it back in January, February. Everyone also now is so engaged. So in a way, I think it's a kind of magnificent thing. But, you know, going back again farther, early days, voting used to kind of look like this, where the typical voter was white male landowning. But you'd go to the schoolhouse, you'd say hi to everybody, you'd ask how you wanted to vote, and you'd declare your preference, be written down. Sometimes the candidate would actually be there, if you could imagine. He would like say thank you, and you would sit down. It was all very sort of formal. But because the scale was so small, it was like, you know, supportable. But once everyone started, communities started growing, people started moving to towns, it became really unwieldy. So you just imagine the economy of scale that needs to grow with our growing democracy, and it's kind of incredible to consider. So let's look at some ballots. The meat of what I show in the book is basically like a 70-year span from like the 1830s or so until like the turn of the century. And, you know, people have asked like how these are in existence, and it's true, they shouldn't be in existence. They're legally required to be destroyed. So those that survived have been called the most fugitive ephemera, which I kind of love that phrase too, as if I like caught all of these. So 1800s, you weren't given an official ballot printed by the government to mark your choice. You may have filled in a piece of paper that might have looked like this from 1827. So the offices were printed, but you would handwrite your preferences into the ballot. Or this one, which is like a bunch of smaller ballots, which are pre-printed for the voter to submit. These are the offices, and this is the names on the back. I just noticed it says Thomas R. So you're like, anyway, on election day, it was also a very different scene where party workers would try to, they would stand in man booths and try to sort of persuade voters, handing out ballots that list all the candidates on their ticket. So it was all or nothing. Like you're going to vote for, you know, the Democrat or the Labor Party exclusively. You're not going to be able to split. So it was an open system. It wasn't secret or regulated. As the electorate grew, it was easier to have the parties just print their own, pay for all the production and distribution. But, you know, when there is no regulation, the foxes were basically in charge of the electoral henhouse. There was no rules about how the candidates get listed, you know, what the deadline was. I think it was probably based on the printer not being able to make any tight fixes. So it was pretty wild westy out there. But it was like a heyday for printers who were left to their own devices to typeset the ballots, right? There was nothing standard about that. So you can see in the 1870s, every party and every race is different. You have some regular Democratic tickets, but they all look so different. And then lots of ballots started having emblems or signifiers at the top, used as a party brand, as well as a device to sometimes help illiterate voters. So it's a lot easier to say vote for the ship rather than the weird, like Dr. Seuss-like tree. Then some ballots had more like blatant messages, like these temperance ballots from the 1870s, you know, show the evils of drink in the form of fathers coming home to their families. And one says, out of the grog shops come woe, misery, and death. Make a note. This ballot was just after the Civil War. And, you know, we talked about ballots as a form of expression. And this is a great example of ballot as a form of protest. You know, we have now a write-in area as a nod to the sort of the demand for an area for free expression. But here we have somebody like literally inking through every single candidate. You know, instead of for Constitution, he's against Constitution. So it's kind of like really a, you know, big middle finger to the administration. Are several examples that were in the Huntington Library showing scratching, what they called, but the marks that you could see through ink or pencil. And also the rules for this was different. Sometimes you would mark through the person you wanted versus the person you didn't want. So you had to really kind of pay attention to the different systems going on. One crazy find was amazing at the New York Public Library, where these things called pasters. So it was not an uncommon tactic to distribute small slips of paper with people's names on it that had adhesive on the back. And then you would go into the polling place and, affix it to your ballot to replace the name you wanted. I feel like we should bring back the paster. Anyway, it was, such a delicate thing that I had never seen them sort of all together, like bound still. So that part was kind of mind-blowing. But then look at these ballots that are completely, quite literally manhandled, but like you got pasters, you got somebody inking, scratching through, you have like holes cut through, like this is really an effort it takes to submit your damn ballot the way you wanted it. And then, I was going along researching and I'm like, what the hell's going on down there? Like, why does Edward Flattery look so bizarre? And it's not like anyone had the answer, but I just started seeing so much more of this like crazy curve type. Definitely it was the vibe of the time, very ornamental period where printers were experimenting with different processes, letterpress, chromolithography, etc. But it still didn't quite fully explain like how totally bonkers some of these were. But you can see also that they were good typographic countermeasures for something like the paster, which is rectilinear. It doesn't really fit on top, but Laverius Hull still gets on that ballot on the right. Or you have this one that has intricate filler. I mean, it is decorative, but it may be serving a purpose in terms of filling in the available space. Or something like this, it's barely legible, but it's certainly designed more as a deterrent. Or this one, which is pretty epic, presidential electors from 1864. I mean, I was just trying to consider like if there was a late edition, there was like no way that could be added. So this is like a magnificent specimen from the Huntington. So I divide the book up into different sections, some of which are shown here. But color is notable in terms of how, I saw a lot of them in color, which was dramatic, but also it made me do a lot more research on the print production methods of that period. So suddenly at this time, you're getting more mass manufactured inks, which was a big deal in color. The chemical formulas, the inventions of petroleum products, it made them more stable and more vibrant. And printers were certainly eager to show off everything at their disposal. So that's one key that I feel like is probably feeding some of these job runs for these ballots. This is an engraved one from Virginia, which is beautiful and ornate. And these, how you can see the two emblems are the same on the ones flanking, just a different colorway and different sort of typographic. So as a designer, you're completely grooving on just sort of the typographic carnival that's happening. And then sort of the colorful aspects of things that were, black ink, but printed on colored paper stock. So these would be super distinctive to poll watchers who had given it to you, and they're just making sure that you're putting it in the ballot box, that they made sure if they paid you a little money or whatever, that it was being well spent. This is a beautiful gang sheet from Boston Athenaeum that would be cut up and distributed at the polls. I just love how Z.B. Vance has a lot of variety in his typesetting. And this lithographic print with hand lettering in two colorways. So a lot of this awesome research was not only just the discovery of me as a researcher, but also like being able to forensically send images of these to print historians or letterpress printers who were practicing and be like, how did this happen? Like, what was the process? What was the stages? So that aspect of sort of print detective work was like super gratifying. No one knew the answer per se, but this is like clearly letterpress. It's clearly bonkers. Like, it was on some sort of scrap paper. So it's just, they were all so intriguing and seem to have so much history, quite literally and figuratively. These are pretty spectacular. These are Republican tickets from Massachusetts in 1878. Really precise examples of multicolor printing using a chromatic press. There's no reason why this ballot has to look this way. Maybe it was a sample print that they just used the ballot composition as a way to test it. This is fun showing it to sort of more type geeks because people were saying, oh, maybe it's set in wood and inked separately, but it just inspires a lot of people to speculate for this one and this one. But just as objects, they're also just like gorgeous to behold. Here's a slide that we'll probably come back to where we talk about representing the bad things, which is, people not being shy at just sort of producing ballots that have their party platform, like anti-Chinese, Chinese must go, working man's party, you know, a Chinaman getting the boot from the working man's party out of California, you know, the property qualification ballot, advocating for property qualifications for colored men, but still rendering it like that. And then this one, kind of my favorite, where you see the little spooky heads, the Halloween heads on the stack by the doorway being kept away to protect the white labor and no more Chinese. The backs of the ballots were also quite spectacular. And going back to that sort of expression of power and parties, this is a sample of front and back to these, showing when the polls are open and closed. But these backs were just on their own, just really beautiful in terms of like sort of engraved and detailed, and also very simple. So another way to make it distinctive for sure. You know, the proliferation of political parties well beyond what we understand as our two-party system was so rampant at that period. So these are just some sample ballot emblems that did not make it in the book. So feast your eyes on some of the hidden material. But yeah, what the heck is the cactus ticket, the Argonaut ticket, anti-boss, but you know, the little red schoolhouse representing the American ticket. And then, you know, we've never had a shortage of patriotism. So home rule for America for the American ticket. So this moment, so much is happening, so much sort of, you know, every party's going bonkers, everyone's printing their own ballots. It's just sort of this kind of free for all. This was also sort of the boss tweet era when everyone was getting really sick of a voting system that was like so partisan and clearly vulnerable to corruption. So the Australian ballot system was adopted in Tasmania in 1859. And here's the big deal about this format, is that it was the first time that they said, okay, production and distribution are going to be done by the government. It's going to be an official ballot. Like before that, there was no official ballot. I think that's hard for people to kind of comprehend. The other factor was that all candidate choices were consolidated on one ballot instead of one per party. So that was another big deal. The biggest deal about this was that the ballot was cast in secret. So you took it to your booth, you marked your choices and put it in a ballot box, and no one knew who you were voting for. And we take that for granted now, but like back then that was like a big deal. Of course, Americans were like, I don't know, it's a little bit risque. So they adopted in Massachusetts, was the first state in 1888. Gradually the other states came along. It was not an even adaptation, but by 1908, the presidential election of Taft, most states were using it. But that allowed also, going back to the consolidated thing, voters could vote split ticket for the first time, as opposed to that sort of crazy mashup thing that you saw before. So this is an example of the new blanket ballot format. This is from 1900. Critics were saying that it was going to be vexing and harassing by the new layout for voters to spend so much time, and they were going to be fatigued. Kind of true. It's like really dense. And you know, you needed to be patient. You needed to know who you were voting for, and you couldn't just, you know, just hand it in without even really looking at it like it was before. But variations on the rules began to emerge. You know, this was 1906, and they are grouped by office. And then you also have a straight party option here. But, you know, suddenly with all the critique of the sort of, you know, taxing nature of this big ballot was on the voter, voting itself became more peaceful. You know, the bars were closed on election day. Electioneering was limited within 100 feet. They like got it together, and suddenly everyone's like, oh, I could just go vote without fear of being killed. Then emblems became appearing again as a way to identify the party and vote the straight ticket. Again, critics called this an insult to the intelligence of the voter, saying there was no improvement in government as long as voters cast their ballots for birds instead of men. We're racing to the finish here, guys. So the late 1800s, like, was, you know, the rise of the machine. So within like 3 decades of this period, you had the steam engine, the telephone, the light bulb, the car, like everything was invented. Everyone had such huge faith in technology, and voting machines were seen as like saviors from fraud, since they eliminated the need for unreliable and potentially like dishonest human vote counters. It all sounds so familiar. But this is an example of a voting booth from 1889 with like a lever system, which you guys may remember. And then this ballot brings us to, you know, no half-baked timeline would be complete without the butterfly. So I did a huge leap over the 20th century because, you know, they're nice samples, but I feel like that's not the meat of it. So I will hand it to Vic to take it from here to bring us into the now.
So, it's funny. I don't get to talk over any pretty ballots. I get to talk
I'm
over.
sorry, I gave you the really awful one.
I don't have any pretty graphics. I've just got boring, bureaucratic ballots that look like the butterfly.
I'm sorry, I took all the fun. It's true.
I know. And actually, one of the funny things is that this is not the only reason, but once we kind of began to take all of the fun out of voting and the power of the parties began diminishing, and the bureaucratization of our voting systems began, voter turnout also began diminishing. At the end of the 19th century, it wasn't uncommon for 3/4 of all eligible Americans to vote. When you get to today, to see that sort of turnout in an election would be utterly unprecedented. Now, I'm not saying that the kind of the ballot itself is what led to the decrease in participation, but it's a reflection and a kind of a push and pull about the way we kind of altered our party system and our voting systems in a way that, effectively did take the fun out of politics. By the same token, of course, the 20th century saw a lot of other forms of fun emerging to compete with the politics of the 19th century. So that's another reason for it. So, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, as the progressive movement and the bureaucratization of our voting system began taking over, America really began experimenting not so much with the way we printed ballots or designed ballots, but began experimenting with the types and the ways that we cast ballots. So you saw the emergence of the punch lever, the pull lever, booth. You saw the punch card, the touch screen, the scanner, all of the incredible ingenious ways to cast and to count ballots. And even to this day, incidentally, despite the kind of the progress of technology, there are a lot of places in the United States where paper ballots are still used. People fill them out and they're all counted by hand at the end of the evening. It's still not all that different from the
Right, it's still paper.
Yeah. And despite the, kind of the progress of technology, the bureaucratization, the increasing kind of regulation and legal kind of oversight of our election system, a lot of the themes that Alicia revealed in her conversation really persist to this day. They may have been shifted in one way or another, but they're still kind of, we haven't really changed that much from the 19th century. After all, like what can someone in 2020 learn from looking at a ballot from 1830 or from looking at a sequence of ballots from the 1850s and 1860s? And there's a surprising amount that you can learn. For example, the confusion about what you're voting for. We're just as confused today sometimes when we take a look at some of these ballots. Take a look at that butterfly ballot, utterly confusing, really difficult for the voter to express their intent on this. Not that different from some of those crazy ballots that you see in the 19th century where people are scratching things out or trying to correct them or something like that. Fraud and corruption continues to be a problem. In the 19th century, one of the reasons that you saw all of the kind of party-controlled ballots is because, people thought it was an opportunity to stuff the ballot box. The party would just print up a bunch of ballots and people would go in and dump a bunch of things in. So, Alicia, you didn't manage to include one of my favorite ballots, which is the tissue ballot, which is a 19th century product.
They don't even exist. I couldn't find, I mean, they might. Yeah. That is like one of my holy grails I ask every time, but they're so fragile. But you can talk about, definitely let's talk about tissue ballots and like even the ballot box with the hidden panels and stuff.
Yeah, so the tissue ballot was a ballot that was, it seems like it was possibly only used once, but who knows, in South Carolina. And they were these literally such tissue paper.
It was like onion skin.
Like onion skin. And so when a voter would go in to cast a ballot, to throw a ballot into the box, it would look like the voter was throwing in would look like the voter was throwing in one ballot, but actually there were 3 or 4 or 5 that were all stacked on top of each other in that tissue paper. And so it was a great way of stuffing the ballot box in, and it was supposedly happened in South Carolina.
There's a lot that happened in South Carolina. I mean, if you had just to interject, another nice little fraud thing was the one where you can vote by whiskers, where this was written up in Harper's, one of these Tammany guys, but basically you can vote once with a full beard, Shave it to like mutton chops, that's another vote. Shave it to like, whatever progression, you would get like 4 or 5 votes from going from bearded to clean shaven. So that's apparently an account also. So,
Right. And
far more creative back then.
Yeah, and of course, to this day, you hear all sorts of stories about identity theft and people pretending to be going and casting ballots for other people's names. It's kind of the same kind of legends persist from the 19th century to the 20th and to the 21st century.
Yeah.
Another theme that is that constantly emerges is the issue of control and party control versus the voter's desire to express him or herself. In the 19th century, when you see all of those pasters, that it is a perfect expression of the tension between the party wanting you to just vote the party line and here's the ticket, go vote it. And on the other hand, the voter saying, no, here's what I want something different.
Yeah.
And even to this day, of course, that's exactly what you see in ballots, that sort of, tension between the voter's desire to express individual desires and to cast individual ballots versus the party's desire to really kind of rigidly conform and push the voter into voting a specific way. You see that.
I remember asking you specifically, like what the history of the write-in ballot is. And I think you made that bridge for me because I was like, oh my God, because I always just saw the write-in, you're like, well, that's sort of a form of protest, but then you realize you trace back, like these are all in that way form of protest.
Yeah. And like one of the other things that you also continue to see, when the bureaucratization and regularization of the voting system happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century, one of the great promises was that there was going to be, well-funded, competently run, scientifically accurate, independent elections. No more party involvement, no more corruption, everything was going to be done. But to this day, of course, incompetence, limited choice, penny pinching continues to sort of vex and bedevil our election system. Now, I hasten to add that our election system is way more accurate and way less corrupt than it ever was in the 19th century. And there's, ample evidence that even the 19th century wasn't necessarily as corrupt as everyone sort of.
It makes for a colorful story, but
it makes a colorful story. And a lot of the effectiveness of our current election system starts with that butterfly ballot, because that butterfly ballot really was like a lightning bolt across the way the United States conducted its elections. And in the wake of the 2000 election and the kind of the problems with the ballot, the United States enacted something which is known as the Help America Vote Act, which sort of like tried to rework or jumpstart greater professionalization and greater accuracy in our election system. And it was based on a kind of a classic American triad: faith in technology, faith in data-driven decision-making, and faith in throwing a lot of money at a problem. So after 2000, we threw almost $2 billion at the states to upgrade all of their machines, upgrade their election system, to establish standards for reviewing voting, just all sorts of stuff. And in truth, no matter how annoying you think voting is today, the fact is that by and large, it is shockingly efficient and effective, and your vote does get counted, which is not to say that there aren't obviously all sorts of individual awful experiences and that there aren't plenty of anecdotes showing problems. But, between 2000 and around 2016, we kind of had entered an era of, on the one hand, increasing kind of partisan furor about voting, combined with increasing competence in the administration of our elections. Never perfect, always pushing to get better, but there was a clear commitment to that. And then, the 2016 happened, and all of a sudden, a lot of the kind of the greatest anxieties of America's voting just got turned to 11. And the anxiety just went through the roof, and it's to the roof today. So what I actually want to do is pivot and talk about where we are today by looking at my two favorite historical ballots. And Alicia is going to show us that. And I want to explain why I think we can learn so much about what we face today from these two historical ballots. So on the left-hand side is an official federal war ballot, and that is the ballot that was created in 1944. That might be the 1942 ballot, or it might be the 1940. No, it's the 1944 ballot. So in the middle of World War II, when almost 12 million Americans were scattered to all ends of the globe, um, as a country, we decided that our democracy and making sure that everyone could vote was of paramount importance. America was going to kind of show to the world and show to its people that no matter where you were, no matter what the circumstances were, we were going to figure out a way to make sure that you got to vote. And as a result, we printed up all of these federal war ballots, just really like crashed through a lot of state election laws, a lot of concerns about like, how's it going to work? We printed them all up, sent them out all over the globe. I mean, it might have made sense, you know, it might have been more important to send food or ammunition
Right, you were
at the time. But
yeah.
we decided, nope, ballots are going to. And more than 4 million people cast their votes from all over the globe in the course of World War II. And the reason I wanted to show that is because I wanted to show that when America, in the midst of any sort of crisis, is committed to making its elections work, it can make elections work.
Yeah, they got the job done.
And we got the job done, and we can still get the job done in 2020. And in fact, there's, you know, obviously a huge effort to do that across the United States at this stage of the game. Now, on the right, however, is a ballot from 1876, which was one of the most hotly contested, conflicted elections in American history. And it was an election where, when it was over, 3 states were unable to submit their electors, their slate of electors, to Washington, D.C. for the election of a president. Because in those 3 states, there was massive violence, intimidation, and an extraordinary amount of conflict during the voting. As a result, when those 3 states, and they were all in the South, so this is in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, when those states were unable to submit their electoral college votes to Washington, D.C. to be counted, the result was that neither candidate managed to obtain a majority of the votes. And so for a period of almost 4 months, there was no winner of the presidential election. It went to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives established a special commission to decide who was ultimately going to be president. And in a backroom deal, essentially made the one man the president and declared the other man the loser. And as part of that backroom deal, dismantled Reconstruction in the South. Now, Reconstruction was already in trouble prior to 1876, 1877. But this was in many ways one of the, you know, kind of the final pivot points in ending Reconstruction in 1877. And so to me, it's a kind of a demonstration of the alternative vision that we could have of 2020, which is one laden with conflict, one where there's no kind of mutual commitment to seeing the election through in a fair and clear way. And in many ways today, we face the choice between the war ballot and the 1876 ballot. And that is today.
Right, I'm gonna stop sharing on that.
Yeah, and we really want, by the way, really want to encourage people to ask questions. Would love for people to ask us questions, and
yeah, please ask questions.
Yes,
make sure you're out there.
Please. I was gonna ask you a question, which was
Me a question.
what was the most unexpected thing you found while you were doing your research?
That's a good question, because there was a lot. With that long ballot that I showed before was another great one. I mean, the things that were the best were just more like, what the heck and why, you know? So that one was a big one. There was a tiny tapeworm ballot, which, as you know, it's not as gross as it sounds, but it's about like bigger than a fortune cookie. But it's about yay big. The type size is like 4 or 5 point, and they managed to list like 26 candidates, I think, for California state legislator. But that was admissible. And that kind of like range of formats was just sort of like mind blowing. And then the public library librarians, again, were so amazing. We're just like, oh, I think this box may be of use to you or of interest. It was like political ephemera. I think that's the one we went through together.
Yeah.
But, you know, going through and seeing the pasters, I literally like, I can't describe like your heart gets faster. You start sweating a little bit. You're worried about sweating on the stuff. And it's just like, oh my God. And you're in the library, so you can't say anything. So I think those moments were just pretty awesome. So
Yeah.
that's why I think the research vibe is really quite exciting. You know, it's not just like a passive experience for me, at least.
Yeah. So, you know, we got one question I'm going to ask, which is someone asked, where do they actually vote on that butterfly, on that 2000 butterfly ballot? And I don't think we can show the image again unless we can. But it was a punch ballot. So basically,
you had a stylus. I didn't include the one image that actually shows the tool that you use to push the Chad through.
Yeah.
So it was an alignment issue. And I know a lot of my questions about this have been like, why the graphic design is so bad? Certainly that's a huge issue, but like, hopefully this talk has shown that there's many other issues in and around that moment. But true, the alignment, if it was off, would allow you to, instead of voting for Gore, you would end up voting for Pat Buchanan, which was a kind of oopsie. Mm-hmm. So you used an actual tool, a stylus.
So there's another question I'm gonna ask and answer, which is from Kate McKenzie, who asks that she's always been amazed why there is no standardization at all and how confusing they are, as well as how graphically ugly. So I'm going to start off answering that, and then I'll turn it over to you, Alicia. One of the reasons why there's no standardization is because in the Constitution, we essentially leave election administration to every individual state. And that's constitutionally dictated, essentially. I mean, there are ways that the federal government could push greater standardization, no question about that. But we leave it to every state. And not only do we leave it to every state, but most states also leave it to each individual county or each individual city. So you've got every single county and city in the United States buying different machines, administering their elections on different days. We've got more than 10,000 election districts in the United States. And every single ballot is different. Like when I go cast my ballot in my neighborhood, it's probably different than the one someone a mile away from me casts, because I've got different, you know, kind of mix of electoral districts and people representing me for different things. So the administration is highly localized in the United States for a variety of reasons. And in consequence, standardization is virtually impossible given the way we actually run our elections. And as to why they're so confusing, now, just because they can't be standardized doesn't mean that they have to be confusing and graphically ugly. And that's something you can answer, Alicia, if you want.
I see, this is where I was like, I worry that I was speaking for like all graphic designers who, you know, are tasked with that job to sort of make them function better. So I will then say that there are organizations like the Center for Civic Design and Whitney's team doing work. You know, it's not sexy. They're like working with like secretaries of state's office to like help with like the signage that says vote here, like helping organize that level. So yes, the ballots are ugly. They're all blah. There's nothing. I mean, I think the one ballot that I have seen that excited me was one in Amsterdam when I happened to be there for election day, which was like an absurd fantasy, as if like lots of graphic designers organized the entire day, because all the signs were really nicely done. The polling place was really organized. The ballots themselves were just like beautifully done. So yeah, it's about sensibility to some degree, but operationally it's an information design issue. And, you know, it's not as easy as just like better ballot design, though. It's also about how they function. So it's definitely about layout, type choices, color, all that good stuff. But it's about how it functions. Like, does it fit in the envelope? Do we have enough envelopes? Like, you know, you get to really think.
You know,
and the scale is just like, oh my God, it's amazing we're doing this at all.
I was stunned to read that apparently the New York City Board of Elections was worried about an envelope shortage this year.
Yes, I know. I heard that too.
Yeah, so I should also add that at the Brennan Center where I work, we have put out several white papers dealing with common design flaws and how it impacts voting. And so it's a sort of thing that we try to get out to election administrators so that they know about like kind of common flaws, common things that you need to do to fix
Right.
it.
And
So,
the tools that they have available to, they have
yeah.
packages that they can say, like, use this. So, I mean, the effort is just awareness and, if their departments will take the initiative to see that as a problem and to sort of like know that that needs to be fixed. So, yeah, I think everyone's been grumpy about the design of it, but there's just like much greater issues at play than just like fixing how it looks, getting there is a really complicated process.
Yeah. So Dale,
Yeah, I like Dale's question.
I like Dale's question. I'm gonna do you want? Dale asked today. There was an article about machine politics in New Jersey, putting fake candidates on the ballot so that the design of the ballot, which would push voters to particular candidates. And then she says, you spoke a bit about this already. Can you talk more about how ballot design has been used to manipulate voters?
You can go first on that one. I mean, I can certainly add some of the things that I was finding along the
way. There are a variety of ways, and I think that's kind of one of the perfect ways that they've been designed. As part of the kind of legal regulatory effort, there's always an extraordinary effort to actually prevent that. So there are rules regarding kind of the tabular display of people's, like the font size always has to be the same, the display always has to be this way, the order of the display has to. So for example, one of the things that we know is having someone first on the list significantly increases the fact that someone will vote for that person. And so kind of the random display of people, of potential candidates is one thing. That's why parties are always kind of like really holding on to their line in the ballot. So that's a real huge way that voters are manipulated. One ballot which I really wish we could have gotten, and that we could never find a copy of. It's a perfect example of how ballot design, I guess, is used to manipulate voters. Are some ballots from the early 1960s in Louisiana, where Louisiana began putting the race of the candidate on next to it. So if Victoria Bassetti was running for, kind of, I guess I would be running for librarian. That's what I would run for. If I were running for
public advocate, I think.
Exactly. It would have said white next to my name, so that it would have been a signal to voters, not to vote for African-American candidates or other people of color on the Louisiana ballot. But we were unable to find a copy of one of those.
Although do you know if they exist even? I mean, it's like a legend. But what's interesting about hearing that story was like, I remember finding, you remember that big one from Oregon that was a blanket ballot, but it allowed space for each candidate to have a statement for their party platform. And, they're very kind of ennobling of like, no corruption, et cetera. But it allowed them to sort of have their own moment of expression where it was like, I am a farmer, send one, sort of like, okay. Yeah. So it's a weird, moment where they can express themselves, not be delineated by their ethnicity per se. But going back to the sort of order and the alphabetization of candidates' last names, I mean, not that I could correlate, but like that one that was incredibly like the 14-foot scroll, those are all alphabetized. And, I asked you like, what the hell? And you were like, well, it wasn't super friendly to the voter. It was sort of like a big middle finger to, the rules that were imposed on them. It's like, okay, we're going to put everyone together. Let's list like 120 names. So, sorry, I'm a little bit off topic, but all these sort of alphabetization, how the orders and how the columns that were created. I read somewhere that one state would rotate every election cycle. The next person would be on the left. So it would just be other weird logics that try to keep it like equal.
Yeah, and parties are not surprisingly constantly lobbying election commissions on how the ballots are displayed and everything like that. But then you add to it the fact that, in a two-party system, you've got basically a state legislature that will tend to pass laws that designate the way the ballot is designed in a way that kind of tends to give the maximum benefit to the two parties. And for example, in New York, there was a recent effort to deny a ballot line to minor parties, or not deny it, but to make it harder for minor parties to qualify to get a line on the ballot. And so it's kind of through the manipulation of the kind of the laws that we today see a lot of kind of ballots and ballot display being manipulated to for the benefit of
Yeah.
of the two-party system rather than.
Yeah, which, yeah, is perfectly in keeping with what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
I'm going to take Courtney. Hi, Courtney. The modern day I voted stickers are a very popular way to show political engagement and act as a positive reinforcement for the act of voting. Were there any artifacts in the past that did a similar function? Was anything ever handed out after a vote was cast? Oh boy,
Yeah.
there's a ton. And it was interesting because when I was first wading into this world, it was definitely within a political ephemera kind of category, which includes campaign buttons, ribbons, you know, and like kind of amazing. They would make these huge balls, and sort of keeping the ball rolling was a phrase that came up that was sort of covered with advertising slogans, but they would push this huge ball through town. Like the campaign aspect is really kind of, it's another sub project. But it wouldn't be like an I voted sticker per se, as far as I know. I don't know if you know anything about the post-voting kind of stage of things, but just the idea of the political ephemera in general is like this massive, huge collector's item too. But that kind of showing your support before had many different forms beyond just your lawn sign.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting kind of distinctions between 19th century kind of the spectacle of voting is that in the 19th century, the spectacle of voting was about who you voted for. Now there's less spectacle, and all you're doing is bragging just about that you did your civic duty, not who you necessarily specifically voted for when you get those I voted stickers.
Exactly, right. It's just the act of voting.
It's just the act of voting. And so one of the things that we did in the 20th century is we made the who you voted for kind of a secret or private thing.
Right, from public to private. Yeah.
It went from public to private. Now, which isn't to say, obviously, that there aren't people who've got lots of, kind of signs on their lawn signs or, wearing pro whoever stickers or bumper stickers or anything like that. There's still plenty of, kind of a proud display of your political affiliation going on. But from the voting perspective, it really has become this kind of much more kind of secretive, constrained, don't look. I don't know if people remember if you ever voted in New York. When New York switched over to the paper ballots, there was just an extraordinary kind of wave of anxiety that came out amongst voters that as they took their ballot and put it into the scanner, some of the poll workers might be able to kind of peek over and see who you voted for. And so everyone got all these little privacy folders, et cetera. The anxiety eventually died down, but it was the idea that anyone in the 19th century would have been anxious about someone seeing who they voted for, it just wasn't possible to be secretive about who you were voting for.
Well, I mean, I read a quote in terms of, and it's in Jill Lepore's article too, about how hiding your vote was an act of cowardice. Like no real gentleman, no real intellectual would, hide their affiliation. You're supposed to sort of say it loud and proud. So I think that's such a fundamental shift in how people express their preferences now. And yet I think at this moment today, that could be changing. Like it's exciting, it's harrowing and so concerning, but sort of the act of people just being, screaming for their rights. I don't know. I have hope, tiny hope, but it just feels like we have more now. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, sorry, I know we have more questions and I'm so excited to ask, but I did want to have you at least touch on what other resources that as citizens people could know about in terms of like election day coming, knowing there's all these issues, like how can any of us like help?
Yeah, no. So I'm on election day, or there's no such thing really as election day anymore. As I think as everyone knows, there's like you get your absentee ballot or your mail-in ballot or your early voting. So it's it used to be obviously that everyone kind of got together in November and voted. Now it's obviously spread out over a longer period of time. And one of the things that goes along with that is a lot of voter confusion and questions. And so there's this great organization, which is called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, which every election runs what's known as an election protection system. And it's I think it's 1 866 hour vote. It's a toll-free number that anyone in America can call if they have any questions about how they're going to vote that day. And it takes an army to staff that call line, and I do it every 2 years. You put in, you do a little bit of training, you put in 2 to 3 hours at a call center, and you just feel you're well trained and you field calls. And when you walk out at the end of the 2 hours of your call, you feel like, oh my God, I just helped 20 people actually vote. And sometimes it's as simple as someone calling up and asking where they're supposed to vote. They don't know their polling station, so you give them the address. Other times it's real stuff happening. You get people who call up who are like, there's some intimidation going on out front. There are people trying to keep people from voting. So you get obviously that sort of stuff you escalate through the system. So if anyone is interested in being manning that system, it's a really terrific and satisfying way to feel like you helped the vote happen.
Good.
Yeah.
We got a lot of questions. It's so exciting, you guys. I don't know how to. Well, I guess I wonder if that was address Christina's questions of, are there special challenges with mail-in ballots? What steps are being taken to minimize confusion, given that poll workers won't be able to answer questions when confusion arises? So I think it stresses me out having this list of like answer or not. So I'm gonna say, okay. I hope that was enough of an answer, Christina.
Yeah, that's great. You want me to try the mail-in ballot? I'll try to give a quick answer to the mail-in ballot.
And there's a few questions too after that about sort of disabilities and ballots, Braille, other disabilities, illiteracy. So we can talk about that one next.
Yeah. So with mail-in ballots, it really, again, it's highly variable. It depends it's so dependent on exactly where you live, whether or not the kind of the mail-in ballot system is well administered, and whether or not voter confusion is minimized. It's, again, remember, we've got almost 10,000 election districts, and each of them is run by 50 states. So it's going to depend on your Secretary of State or even whoever in your county is administering it. There's obviously a huge effort, by a lot of groups like the Brennan Center to make that mail-in ballot system more effective, to fund it well, to message to everyone well about it, to let everyone know what the rules governing their mail-in ballot system is. And then there's a huge legal effort that's going into protecting all of the mail-in ballots, to making sure that if you do mail in a ballot, that the people who have to count it do in fact count it. So there's both this huge external effort to make sure it's really well done, and then there's also this effort to make sure that the election administrators are doing a good job. But I just can't give you a blanket answer to that question, other than to say that a lot of people are trying really hard to make it work.
Yeah. I don't know if we're going to get to everyone because it's they're specific, but I will ask the broader question that covers a few people asking about special considerations, any special considerations taken for people who are disabled or visually impaired. I mean, I know that speaks more to, say how the touch screens are in many different languages and you can do it large, type and that kind of stuff. So I think that in a way is obviously the upside of how technology and touchscreen interfaces can help. Obviously, I thought you had sent me that really interesting brief about proposing that, maybe within each interface, you have a small sort of, basically like a commercial, but a moment where a video could be inserted for different candidates to sort of advocate for their position, which would help people be educated at that moment. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of ideas out there. It's a lot about sort of who wants to take the step to implement and who wants to spend the money to do it.
Yeah, exactly. But there are laws governing, accessibility of ballots to people with disabilities or people who've got, and the most states, but again, not all, because remember, it's sort of a patchwork quilt, but most states, in addition to the paper ballot for anyone who needs accessibility because of language issues or vision issues, usually do have a ballot marking device or a special electronic device that's available for people who need it for greater accessibility. But incidentally, I mean, that's a definite upgrade from what it was like in the 19th century, right? I mean, in the 19th century, you don't see any kind of effort to make voting easier for people with disabilities or for the elderly or for, for anyone who was other than able to, kind of literally march to the polls and take care of it. So, so that was cool. Well,
I think my dad has a question. That's a good one, actually. It's
I have
about,
a question for you.
oh my God, you guys are awesome. There's so many questions. Where to go? What is the likelihood that we will have mandatory voting like Australia, and do you think that would benefit democracy?
Well,
benefit democracy. I mean, I'm just speaking as sort of like Joe Schmo citizen, just like everybody else. And yeah, I would like that to happen. What do you think from a legal perspective?
Well, I don't think it's legally ever going to happen. I just don't think in the United States, where we it's just really unlikely that would happen. Although I agree with you, I would really like it to happen. I think, all of the evidence is that the more turnout you have, the better the democracy functions.
Sure, right.
It not only kind of encourages faith in the outcome, it encourages faith that, this really is what the majority of Americans want. But it also, the kind of the evidence seems to indicate, it's imperfect evidence, but the evidence seems to indicate that when you have mandatory voting and mass turnout, there's actually less partisanship and more kind of a move towards
the middle, yeah,
less polarization.
Do you think it's unrealistic for us just because no one's going to tell us what to do type of that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, think about what's going on with the masks right now. I mean, you can, the First Amendment protects your freedom of expression, but it also protects your freedom of, like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be forced to express
myself.
We
can see how we're sort of wasted by our own petard in terms of this hunger for liberty. And, we are a bootstrap kind of nation, but that, also perpetuates an attitude of just sort of like, refusal to adhere to the rules. So I think, I don't know, seeing that sort of through line, because I was going to say, touching back on how this whole thing started, was in 2016 when I doubled down on this research, because I was just so depressed. I had to sort of go to history to see, like, well, didn't Andrew Jackson, wasn't that a bad time? I'm sure we survived that. And so that's when I started down this whole thing. And then at the end, I came out sort of with the judgment of, like, we did survive, but, like, just barely. And, we're still dealing with so many problems that we have today.
So I was going to ask, someone asked a question. What was the reasoning for making it illegal to keep historical records of the ballot?
Yes, that's another good one. I think that's also my dad.
Yeah. Oh.
No, if there's another Richard out there, thanks, Baba. Yeah, I mean, you would know better in terms of the actual regulations that were in place, but it was just meant to, discourage fraud and sort of destroying the ballots and keeping them, the tallies secret. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's just, like a bunch of extra ballots is essentially, effectively evidence of ballot stuffing. So, you wanted to destroy them all after the fact. And also, I think the other thing is that people just really regarded them as disposable. They were unimportant once you got the...
Right. I mean, a lot of the ones that I was finding were like ballot officials that would use them on the back to like write out what the tallies were. So it was sort of this crib sheet and then just like put it in their pocket. So that doesn't explain everything, because some collectors were out there, I think canvassing, obviously, but you see them as sort of like scrap paper.
So someone asked, what was the hardest part about research and what was the best part?
The hardest part was not eating or drinking for hours. Because, I'm a working gal. My partner, Sarah Gephardt, had let me run off to the library whenever I could from the office. But, I had a certain amount of time and you wanted to get through like X number of books, again, not knowing what it was. So sitting down in a space that didn't allow for anything but your laptop and anything else, it was just sort of an endurance race in that way. So I felt like before I had the NYPL space, which addresses another question, but it was like this for other places, but I felt like a snake. I would just like get the volume and just try to like eat the whole thing and then like be out of there, because I had to give it back to the desk. And I was telling you that because the idea of having that space just gave me some breathing room. And then they upgraded me to the Allen room, which is more like cubbies, which is also where Robert Caro wrote his work. So it just kind of felt a little like fancy. But anyway, so that kind of space to think was the best part for sure. The worst part is just sort of like not being hydrated, but you know.
Yeah, but there also must have been like tons of ballots that I remember you couldn't fit them in. It was like you had to kill your darlings with a lot.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, Abby will tell you, my editor was like, you know, there's a lot of them. I'm like, oh no, they're all amazing. And I used to, as a designer of exhibitions, working with often collectors who couldn't choose. And you know, you're like, oh my God, just pick 10. They all look the same. And I was that other person of like, no, this one has the blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I feel that side of it. So
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, here's a good one. Was there any influence of women's suffrage on ballot design?
And I would add to that Katie's question of any notable change in the ballot format after 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, which is a good question.
Yeah.
Too.
So I'll talk a little bit about the women's suffrage issue for a moment. So one of the things that happened with women's suffrage is that the federal 19th Amendment was pretty late in the day. By the time the 19th Amendment was passed, I think upwards of 30 states already allowed women to vote in some way or another. And beginning in the early 1880s, a lot of Western states began allowing women to vote on specific elections. So for example, women could vote for school board, or they might be able to vote for a city office or something like that. And so that was the sort of the way that they experimented. And as a result, I have seen specific women's ballot boxes, like ballot boxes for women to put their ballots in, but I've never seen, although there surely must have been ballots printed specifically for women, like kind of like the ones Alicia showed. But by the time they began doing the machines, the pull lever machines, there are these great machines that had separate booth entrances for ladies and gents, and then there was a lever that the election administrator could pull, and then
whoever went in, if it was a lady or a gent, it was like lady or gent,
and it would present the gent or the lady a different ballot, or a different set of levers to pull. Actually,
really,
yeah, not different levers, but the card behind the lever would be filled in differently. So when they pulled the lever, it registered a different set of votes than if the men if the men
went. They didn't vote on the same ticket.
Sorry, what?
They didn't vote on the same ticket. It was different.
They were presented literally different options.
I saw the difference of the polling.
Yeah. And then there are definitely, you can find anti-suffrage ballots.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that happens in the early 20th century is that women's suffrage is very closely tied with the temperance movement. So as a result, a lot of the kind of temperance-oriented, the pro-temperance-oriented ballots are also very kind of like, for example, you showed that ballot that kind of displayed the
drunk dad and the not drunk dad
versus the not drunk family, and so there was a lot of that sort of appeal to that sort of sentiment, and then of course once the 18th Amendment was passed, that sort of decreased the opposition. The assumption in the early 20th century was that if women were given the right to vote, that they would overwhelmingly pass prohibition and temperance nationwide. Mm-hmm. So that was a big part of the kind of the organized opposition to women's voting. So once a prohibition was actually passed, giving women the vote was no longer, it was no longer relevant to this critical issue. And so a major source of opposition to women voting dropped out. And that's a big part of the reason why the 19th Amendment passed. In terms of the 15th Amendment and its impact on ballots, that's one of those great things that when I got a chance to, I'm from the South, and so when I was going home, I would go to kind of archives, and I was always on the hunt for racist ballots.
That was like your thing. I mean, that's certainly a spicy one. But I know
Right.
we were texting each other pictures of like, check this out, oh, check this out. So
Yeah, and there were certainly kind of external ephemera, kind of placards or of people urging votes because this person was states' rights or whatever. But I'm not sure that we ever actually found ballots that clearly,
I know it wasn't what I mean, certainly I was delighted to find that trove of anti-Chinese. There's a few more that I didn't include, but there's someone who was on an explicitly anti-Chinese platform who declared that, after 24 hours of gaining office, he would run everyone out of town, all the Chinese out of town. But the other hilarious thing, and this is to all the designers out there, is that it was typeset in what we know as chopsticks, which is like a Chinese menu font. So it was sort of like, anyway. So those kind of ways to look at those kind of.
Yeah, and actually, that Mississippi ballot that you showed earlier,
Yeah.
the one
Yeah.
from 1868, where the person had crossed everything out. So
Mm-hmm.
that was sort of like, I think, evidence of what was going on, because it was clearly a Democrat, a Democrat, which was the
Right.
racist party.
Right, bad guys.
And they were the bad guys in the immediate post-Civil War era. It was clearly a Democrat who took a Republican ballot that had been given to him, and as an act of protest was crossing out all of the kind of pro-Reconstruction Republican candidates, etc. And so that's a sort of like an ephemeral piece of someone, kind of using.
Well, that's a good. Somebody else had asked about Republicans who hate Trump writing in someone else as their choice for president who's a different candidate but still within the same party. Could that ever succeed? So it's kind of like, ooh, could it?
Well, I mean, consider the fact that one of Alaska's senators is.
Oh yeah, that worked.
Right in.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so if there's a coordinated effort, maybe that's another. Huh.
Yeah.
I hope you didn't.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Oh boy. Okay, I don't know.
So I think
always has good questions. It's a big one though. What level and quality of federal standardization might be possible without superseding state control? And then I think we'll take like one or two more and wind it up. But do you want
so
we don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So constitutionally speaking, a pretty higher level of federal standardization or control could probably be accomplished.
Yeah.
It would be, kind of a combination of the federal government spending a lot of money and conditioning receipt of money on kind of meeting certain standards. And in fact, kind of at the end of, I think it's at the end of 2018, Congress passed a big wad of money went to the states for them to be able to upgrade their voting machines, because I remember I talked about HAVA and the $2 billion that was given in 2000. Well, a lot of states went off and bought what are effectively computers to count all of it, to cast and count all of their ballots. And, by around 2018, a bunch of 18-year-old computers needed a little bit of an upgrade. So when Congress passed that law, and I think it's the end of 2018, don't hold me perfectly to that date, they conditioned receipt of all of this money on some standards and some requirements about how the machines were going to work, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a fairly, the federal government does have levers of power in order to do this. The issue is just, I think, as everyone is aware, that the way we vote, when we vote, who gets to vote, has become such a really source of conflict in the parties right now that it's kind of becoming increasingly hard to find common ground, except, again, kind of the fair administration of elections does seem to, kind of every once in a while draw kind of consent across party lines in Washington. And, I think we all still hold out hope that we're gonna get to it, in the next few years. So
the next few years?
Well, we're definitely not going to get to it
I know.
this election. You and I were talking about this, and I was saying to you that, like, sort of like, initially my analogy was like, voting in America is like a aircraft carrier. It moves.
No, I think you said it was like a flotilla of
right. it's like a flotilla of 50 big ships and thousands of little ships, and they're and turning the whole flotilla.
Right. I mean, everyone's heading in the general direction, but everyone's
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah, and turning the whole flotilla is like you can't. It rarely works 120 days before an election. You can write a few ships that are kind of veering off, and you can maybe squeeze it in this direction or another, or prove something a little bit this way or that way or something like that. But it's I guess the other analogy is it's like herding cats, right? So that's the other thing.
I know. And I was talking to your associate Larry Norton, who is who's another Brennan Center fellow who is you'll see him on TV a lot for people about voting fraud and machines. But to your point about how 2000 galvanized this whole other legislative effort to sort of like reconcile the ills. The hope and the worry is that, if 2020 becomes a massive shit show, that it'll inspire, great change for the better. I mean, I don't wish for this at all, but I feel like we're kind of heading that way. So,
so here's another question for you. I like this question. Do you think you might do an edition looking at ballots in other countries?
Oh, that's Angela. Hi, Angela. And also Jane had something similar. I would love to. In fact, I was super distracted talking about herding cats at the beginning of this because a whole sort of deep dive in sort of India and sort of anecdotes about that. I would love to do another book on this in case I haven't, keeping the ballot fires burning. But, in terms of then somebody else asking about what's next, which happens to be my husband, he might mean like, when can we have dinner? But I'll say like, what's next in projects for you? So, because just broadly speaking, the research and the exposure that I had with a more deeper residency at the NYPL has just shown me amazing offerings and holdings that every librarian who's in charge of these collections holds. They're just kind of waiting for people to ask the right questions. So it's sort of a broader lesson that I tell students of just sort of like, go see the thing, hold it in your hand. That's a huge one because seeing digitally gives you some sense, but when you're holding it in your hand, the history and the time compression that I experienced was just like, it had that whole physical effect. So, but then, the librarians be like, oh, did you see this and this and this? Like talk to people who know, it's better than Google by a mile. And Ian Fowler at the map division, I was in there I made up some reason, and it just was like this awesome feast. He would set out a buffet and it was just delightful. So I'm happily gonna mine that material for more research books in this vein. Anyway, it's all out there. It just needs to be given the light. So I would also, if we wanna close up now, because it's already 8:20. I just wanna sort of recall a little bit how we met, because I was in the throes of this research. I had so many questions about like, what is tissue? Why is this, just why, so many whys. And when we met, it was through the grace of our friend Kevin and Dale, who connected us. And then finally we sat down, and it was, for me, it was like this massive therapy session. It was like, oh, fine. I could talk to somebody about ballots except for my husband and Sarah and my daughter. So I'm just so grateful for our connection. And I feel like you're such the right person to sort of bring the ballots into the present day. And we've had such great exchanges about sort of how I look at ballots and how you look at ballots and how we sort of meet in the middle. And it's just like a nice transition for me.
And for me, I was just like so excited because, I love these ballots, and I think they teach us so much about today. And whenever I talk to anyone who's kind of in the current election law world, they're sort of like, why are you so obsessed with this ballot from 1876 or 1880? And I'm like, no, it teaches us everything. And so like being able to like find someone who kind of loved these ballots as much as I did was so exciting. But even more than loving them, it was like you found them, which is like, and with your kind of incredible, kind of eye for the details and the beauty of the ballots. It was beyond a thrill. I remember that day when we were in the library, and I was like a kid in the candy shop.
Oh my God. And I was so like showing them to you. I showed them to anybody who would give me the time. But that was just so satisfying. And yeah, I mean, for me, meeting librarians, meeting printers, letterpress printers who would help me sort of examine and really look at it and sniff it out, paper restorers who were trying to look at the grain of the paper. I don't know, it was just an amazing nexus of so many different interests that I had, but sort of so many worlds. So
I think that's actually kind of a good way for us to close out, which is to talk about paper, right? So like I learned from you, which I just really had no idea of, the kind of the development of how America's democracy was fueled by the kind of the development of the actual paper business.
Well, think about how people were getting news. You're sort of like waiting for the guy on the horse to come tell you it. And then everybody had a press typically, but supplying that press with cheap ready-made paper and cheap inks was an issue. So when people went from paper printed from linen to paper printed from wood, which was endless at that time, it radically changed the level of literacy, distribution, print production, like it all exploded. So that was where I went crazy, just sort of trying to parse out how, not to exact, I mean, I'm not a historian, but you sort of see how all these waves are affecting, people being more aware because they can read it on a, news sheet that gets printed. And so they become more active politically. Whereas before they're out farming, they didn't have really time to, spend on politics. They were busy like staying alive. So it's a really beautiful convergence of all the social rhythms and developments technologically and sociologically that sort of become emblemized in the ballot. So that part was kind of beautiful. So
and it became like this virtuous cycle of like, paper and democracy feeding each other,
right?
And expanding each other. And I think, one of the themes of the book is that paper is back. That we spent.
Paper never left. I mean, it leaves, but it always comes.
Yeah, we spent the 20th century doing touch screens and all of these kind of technologically kind of complicated things, and now all of a sudden it's like, no, paper. Let's go back to that. That worked.
Yeah.
And we're back to paper.
Yeah.
And it's hopefully the virtuous cycle of our democracy of paper and people. Sort of.
I have hope.
Everyone get the book.
Okay, Chris, I don't know, Chris, if you want to close it out, or how does this?
I'm back. Thank you so much, Alicia and Victoria. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. I think that was really awesome and thorough and very apropos right now.
Yes.
If anybody missed any of the event, it'll be on YouTube very soon. And please buy the book if you haven't already. We have the link on the event page and in the chat. And every book helps us put on more creative free events, and it helps out Alicia. And it will be 10% off for a limited time only if you haven't gotten it yet. And thank you.
Okay, thanks for having us, Powerhouse. And thank you for everybody too for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.